Recently, a pretty critical video on Alan Sokal and the Sokal Hoax was made.
You were misled by Alan Sokal's intellectual dishonesty. How does that make you feel?
And I got a bit animated watching it. I ask you, is it fair to use this quote in the way that it's being used, portrayed in the video right now? I think it says exactly the opposite. For those who don't know, the Sokal Hoax refers to a satirical paper created by a physicist, Alan Sokal, which was submitted and then subsequently published in a quote-unquote postmodern academic journal, creating a big scandal at the time.
What happened was that a huge discussion ensued, as I say, international discussion, about whether this showed anything of importance, and if so, what. The fact that such a thoroughly confused but cleverly disguised incompetent piece that could only have been seen as parodic if you knew what it was saying, could have been accepted for publication in what counts as one of the premier journals in sort of broadly social constructivist critique of science.
I believe this video criticizing Alan Sokal is at times misleading and sometimes, unfortunately, just plain mistaken. So, in an effort to preserve a more balanced account of what I believe the Sokal hoax truly was, I will now proceed to highlight these inaccuracies. First, I believe that the video in question describes the content of the satirical paper made by Alan Sokal in quite a misleading way.
So, the representation of the Sokal affair as a spoof research paper getting published in a rigorous peer-reviewed journal has two problems right off the bat. What's in it? And what it was published in. And since I imagine no one's going to read the paper, let me give you the broad strokes. Transgressing the Boundaries starts off by positioning Sokal on the postmodern side of the debate, with a recap of the critical science hits. Physical reality is a social construct, scientific knowledge reflects the social context it was created in, etc., etc. Then he outlines the paper. His goals are to 1. Review philosophical ideas related to gravity and quantum physics, 2. Sketch the outlines of emerging theories of quantum gravity, and 3. Comment on the cultural and political implications of these scientific developments. And then he does exactly that. The first section summarizes different interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity, citing a combination of physicists and thinkers from the humanities. Then he describes different proposed theories of quantum gravity, a subject that attempts to unify the theories of quantum mechanics and general relativity into something that actually makes sense together. And he ends by discussing his own and others' thoughts on what all this could mean for progressive political projects. He successfully delivered on what he said he would do in the paper. He reviewed some ideas.
Yeah, now, this little review, I think, might be a bit misleading because Sokal said some pretty outrageous things in the paper that were just plain wrong. So, maybe he was kind of reviewing certain areas of physics, but he was doing a very bad job at reviewing it, if you want to put it that way. So just for the sake of balancing things out a bit, let me just cite to you some of the things that Sokal was saying. Okay, so for example, Sokal said that Einstein's equations in the general theory of relativity are highly nonlinear, which is why traditionally trained mathematicians find them so difficult to solve. Now, this is absolutely not true. It's not because mathematicians are traditionally trained that they find them difficult to solve. It's because they are much more difficult than linear equations to solve. For some of them, we don't know how to do it. Then he says, the pi of Euclid and the g of Newton, formerly thought to be constant and universal, are now perceived in their ineluctable historicity. Now, the pi of Euclid and the g of Newton are not formally constant, they're constant. They're just constant, okay? And saying something like that is, very weird in physics, to say something like that. There's not been any change in the constant nature of the pi of Euclid or the g of Newton. Then Sokal refers to complex number theory as a new and still quite speculative branch of mathematical physics, while in fact complex number theory is basically as well established as anything ever gets in mathematics. It's not new and certainly not quite speculative branch of mathematical physics. So these are things that would immediately make a physicist or mathematician cringe. From the review she gave, it seems like he was giving his thoughts on what was going on. Well, that's one way to put it, but another way to put it is that he was saying some nonsense. And then he was quoting authors that were saying things that were nonsensical from a physical or mathematical standpoint. So, for example, he quotes a lot of authors that say things that don't make any sense. And one of them is Paul Virilio. that says, quote, "The dromospheric space, space speed, is physically described by what is called the logistic equation, the result of a product of the mass displaced by the speed of its displacement, m times v." Now, the logistic equation has nothing to do with m times v. It just has nothing to do with it. And Sokal would quote these other authors, and he would, praise them. Other things that Sokal did was reference multiple works that said the opposite of what he claimed or were totally unrelated. He claimed that it was a proven fact that the hegemonic Zimilo-Fraenkel framework was insufficient for liberatory mathematics. This is a bit like saying that addition is hegemonic. He committed non-sequitur logical fallacies. He asserted things without evidence. He wrote word salad sentences on purpose. He said that Witten's derivation of not invariance proved a connection between the external structure of the physical world and its inner psychological representation. He said things that are elementary false, like that if something is non-commuting, it implies it's non-linear, etc., etc. But let's continue.
Outlined some theories and commented on them. What he did not do, or even explicitly aim to do, was argue anything.
Sokal also did actually argue something in the paper, although, yes, he did it quite badly, but he argued that quantum gravity could be the first quote-unquote postmodern science, could be a good candidate to be the first postmodern science, because it was subjective, fluid, and non-linear.
If you actually read it, you'd immediately see Sokal's paper is not trying to imitate a research paper. No data were collected, no methods were developed, no real analysis was conducted. It was just a vague think piece.
Yeah, it was a vague think piece with a lot of things that were, factually wrong. Okay.
I say this because I think the power of Sokal's big reveal was predicated on this misconception that his paper made strong but poorly argued scientific claims. But this wasn't a parody of a physics research paper. It was a parody of a philosophy essay that talks about physics. It's just a mildly interesting collection of loosely connected ideas and quotes, so Sokal pointing to the lack of robust evidence or argumentation feels a little misplaced.
Here I believe Sokal is simply clarifying that some of the stuff he wrote had logical fallacies baked in, and other things he wrote were simply wrong.
Which might make you wonder, okay, so it's not trying to make a data-driven argument, but then why was it published in an academic journal? Enter the second issue, the journal in question.
Another potentially misleading point in the video is the description of the journal in which the hoax got published, because it could leave the impression in the viewer that this journal would just publish anything, since it wasn't peer-reviewed.
Sokal submitted his paper to a journal called Social Text, and here's how the editors described it in an article they published in response to Sokal's hoax announcement. As a non-referee journal of political opinion and cultural analysis produced by an editorial collective, Social Text has always seen its lineage in the little magazine tradition of the independent left as much as in the academic domain, and so often balances diverse editorial criteria when discussing the worth of submissions, whether they be works of fiction, interviews with sex workers, or essays about anti-colonialism. In case you don't know, a non-referee journal means that it doesn't do peer review. And
this is another very interesting point that often gets brought up when you talk about the Sokal hoax. The journal wasn't peer-reviewed, so anything goes on the journal. Well, the journal wasn't peer-reviewed, but it was editor-reviewed. The editors were Andrew Ross, Stanley Aronowitz, George Udice, and Randy Martin. So these guys are the guys that decided if something got published or not on Social Text, and they performed an editor review. Now, I've luckily had the chance to publish even on a very top journal in my field. And in any case, for all of my publications, what has always happened is that two peer reviewers have, assessed the value of my work, and then they have decided if it was valuable enough to let it be published somewhere. Now, here we have four people, assessing the value of the work. And of these four people, three of them have Wikipedia pages, and they were considered very important in cultural studies, in critical theory. These guys are some of the top minds in these fields. And some of these guys have explicitly talked about science, and have been written books critical of the science of power and stuff like that. So maybe you would expect these editors to find the mistakes. But let's see what else is being said.
Not only was Social Text not peer-reviewed, it also publishes opinion pieces and fiction.
Okay, so I have to immediately...
pieces and fiction. I don't emphatically repeat that to imply that a journal that publishes opinion pieces and fiction alongside more rigorous scholarship is an inherently ridiculous thing. I personally read a lot of opinion pieces and fiction and don't think that putting them next to more rigorous scholarship would disqualify either from having value. But surely we can see how Sokal's loose collection of philosophical and political musings into such a publication is both not that wild a thing to happen and a very different thing than a bad research paper being accepted into a peer-reviewed journal, right?
So just to be clear, the editors thought they received a dense philosophical tract. This is what they thought they received, a dense philosophical tract from a professional physicist. And here I'm quoting them. Now, one of the editors apparently didn't even believe that the hoax was a hoax when Sokal said it was a prank. One of the editors was really double-fooled, in the sense that you couldn't even shake him out of the conviction that it wasn't a prank, after it was revealed that it was a prank. Okay.
Also worth pointing out that Sokal's article wasn't even going to be accepted at first. The editors of Social Text sent it back with revisions, but apparently he refused, so they wrote him off as a, quote, difficult, uncooperative author, and put his paper on the maybe we'll publish it later pile, where it sat for 2 years before they pulled it out to use in a special Science Wars issue. This is how they described their choice to eventually publish it. We read it more as an act of good faith, of the sort that might be worth encouraging, than as a set of arguments with which we agreed. A contribution from someone unknown to the field whose views, however offbeat, might still be thought relevant to the debate.
This is, very charitable to take the words of the people who have been pranked after they've been pranked at face value. It's very charitable. Okay.
So they didn't present his work as some officially endorsed take or something. They didn't even think it was worth publishing on its own. They just included it as one of many perspectives in an ongoing debate. Again, not that wild of a thing to happen. A last minor note about the paper that might make me sound like a crackpot, but let's do it anyways. Sokal believing that the things he wrote about in his fake paper are nonsense does not, a priori, make them nonsense. Like, doing an impression of someone with ideas you don't agree with doesn't actually do anything to disprove those ideas.
Yeah, here I agree with her. This is absolutely right. Doing an impression of somebody who you think is saying nonsense, it doesn't imply that the thing you're parodying is nonsense. And that's why Sokal, wrote 2 books on the matter, explaining why he thinks some stuff is nonsense or bad or just wrong or unproductive.
It just means you don't agree with them. Don't get me wrong. I am not saying that everything in Sokal's paper really did make sense. There were certainly parts I read that were, at least to me, a person with advanced degrees in physics, pretty clearly parody. Like there was a section on topology, which is a branch of mathematics concerned with shapes and how many holes they have, and its implications on Freudian psychoanalysis. And who knows, maybe there's a version of the connection between shapes and psyches that actually does make some kind of sense in some kind of context, but from Sokal's text alone, I don't see anything of meaning or value in that passage. That said, there's plenty of stuff that he quotes, references, or states without argument that I sincerely think has value and don't see any reason for an editor to question the legitimacy of. I don't think the paper has a coherent thesis that I agree with, mostly because it barely has a thesis, but a lot of the bits and pieces he throws together reference more robust lines of reasoning that many people find interesting and I would unironically accept as legitimate, that I would unironically make whole videos about even. So when Sokal says in his reveal, it's understandable that the editors of Social Text were unable to evaluate critically the technical aspects of my article. What's more surprising is how readily they accepted my implication that the search for truth in science must be subordinated to a political agenda, and how oblivious they were to the article's overall illogic. The illogic Sokal contends should have been apparent to the Social Text editors is rooted not in any objective assessment.
Yes, the thesis borders on incoherence, logical fallacies are inserted throughout the article, a lot of stuff is simply very strongly asserted without any kind of evidence, many things that are just plain wrong are said, some references say the opposite of what Sokal says they do, but no. Other than this, no objective assessment can be made.
But Sokal's own beliefs about the ideas he aims to discredit, saying they didn't realize the stuff I intended as nonsense is in fact nonsense, is just...
Well, some of the stuff was actually just wrong, plain wrong, and just illogical.
They didn't realize the stuff I intended as nonsense is in fact nonsense, is just not a real argument. So...
Yeah, no, here, again, I agree. Yeah, she's just repeating what she said before, but, Sokal elaborates on why he did the prank, on why he thinks certain stuff is nonsense or unproductive or just wrong. He doesn't do it, during the prank. He does it after the prank in some books.
That Social Text failed to evaluate the technical aspects of his paper, even though that's not in the purview of this journal. He concludes that the editors accepted his weakly supported thesis as truth, even though publishing it doesn't necessarily mean that, and he marvels at how stupid they must have been to not see the ridiculousness of its premise, even though much of what he wrote intending to be nonsense is widely accepted in many scholarly circles. The Sokal affair only looks like this big gotcha if you haven't read his paper, aren't familiar with the journal it was published in, and don't have a working knowledge of both physics and the kinds of scholarship.
Okay, but why would the editors apologize then? Let me just go and get some other quotes from the editors themselves, to not misquote anybody. So the editors issued an apology for having published the prank. Obviously, we now regret having published Sokal's article and apologize to our readers. I guess, what are they apologizing for then if, nothing wrong went on? I think the editors themselves know that it wasn't right to publish something that had blatant mistakes about how our universe works, about how, math and physics works. They probably felt a little bit ashamed of the fact that they had, let this guy quote a bunch of academics that were saying things that were blatantly wrong, and then showering them with praise, and just, let this article pass. Okay.
He's mocking. That's why I am making this video. He wrote a crappy paper in bad faith, imitating ideas he doesn't respect, and it was reluctantly accepted by a non-peer-reviewed.
No, okay. It wasn't reluctantly accepted, though. Let's be clear on this, because Dr. Fatima said before, she said something that's right, that's correct, that the editors asked Sokal to make some corrections, and Sokal didn't make them. So Sokal didn't make the corrections, and then they published the article anyway. Now, as any working scientist will tell you, usually when a peer review or an editor asks you to make some minor corrections to the footnotes, when an editor asks you to make really any kind of correction at all, you usually tend to comply with the editor. Usually because you want your paper to get published. And you know that if you're going to make these corrections, you're actually happy when you get somebody that tells you, look, you have to correct these things in your paper and then we'll publish it, and then it seems ripe for publication. You see that as an encouraging sign because it means that likely you're going to get published. So usually you never refuse to make corrections. And if you refuse to make the corrections the peer reviewers or the editor is asking from you, usually it's very likely that your paper is not going to be accepted. They're going to say, oh, you don't want to make the corrections we think are necessary for publication? Well, we're not going to publish your paper. But in this case, Sokal refused to make the corrections, and then the article was published anyway. It doesn't point to the fact that it was reluctantly accepted. It points to the fact that they really wanted to publish it. If between the two, it wasn't reluctantly, it seems more like they wanted to publish it. To me, at least. This evidence points towards the fact that they really wanted to publish it. And again, here she's going to say a non-peer reviewed journal. And yeah, that's technically true, but the journal was editor reviewed by 4 editors, and 3 of these, they were leading minds in their field at the time. And when I mean leading minds, I mean internationally. At this point, Dr. Fatima highlights the lax standards in many areas of academia, citing several instances where journals in various fields were duped into publishing nonsense, and she is absolutely correct. In fact, I know of journals that have lax standards in my own field. I think we should try to raise the standards all around, from math to cultural studies. This is why I, as I imagine most working scientists, gladly welcome hoaxes or people who expose bad practices or lax academic standards in their own field, in my own field. I think I welcome it. I think this should be the correct reaction, not trying to, contort oneself into saying that nothing bad happened. Next comes a part that I, unfortunately, didn't really enjoy much.
After all my research, the only thing I can confidently conclude from the events of the Sokal affair is that Alan Sokal does not know how to make rigorous claims about something like ideological bias in an academic journal. In one of his many, many follow-up writings about the hoax, Sokal walked back the conclusion of his experiment from a statement about the whole vague field of cultural studies /STS/postmodern.
I don't think it's fair to say walked back. If he walked back, I want to see what statement did he walk back. I don't think Sokal ever said that this proves something of a whole field. So it's a bit misleading to say that he walked back this statement about the broad postmodern sphere
to a statement about just the social text, saying, "My hoax proves only that the editors of one rather marginal journal were derelict in their intellectual duty by publishing an article on quantum physics that they admit they could not understand without bothering to get an opinion from anyone knowledgeable in quantum physics, solely because it came from a, quote, conveniently credentialed ally, flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions, and attacked their, quote..."
Here exactly, Sokal is saying that this doesn't prove anything about the broad field. It's a piece of evidence regarding the social text, the editors of social text. So it seems like they could have had some ideological preconceptions, etc., etc.
Enemies. I explained in part 1 why I think he's massively overstating what the intellectual duty of social text was, but even if we take the first part of this statement as true, it doesn't logically necessitate the second part. That the paper was published does not prove why it was published, let alone that it was published because of ideological flattery. And if it's not clear how the jump from his singular data point to a confident declaration of its sole explanation is completely unfounded, let me give you a counterexample of what sound deductive reasoning about publishing bias looks like. In 1990, William Epstein, a social worker and sometimes professor of social work, wanted to test whether journals in his field exhibited confirmation bias. That is, whether they're more likely to accept papers whose results paint social work in a good light. This research question makes Epstein's work an excellent foil to Sokal's experiment because they were both trying to demonstrate a bias in the kind of information that some journals will publish, just in different disciplines. Here's Epstein's method. He took an old paper about a social work intervention, changed the title and the author, and made it just bad enough that it could feasibly be rejected or accepted. Then he made 2 versions of the fake mediocre paper, one with a positive result and one with a negative result. Everything else was identical. He submitted these fake papers to 146 journals in social work and related fields. Half got the positive result and half got the negative result. Finally, he analyzed his own results using statistical analysis on the acceptance rates and qualitative analysis on the reviewer comments. And here's the gag. Even with his robust experimental design, Epstein didn't try to make any claims as to what was causing the bias he found. He could show that a bias existed, tentatively in his own words, but even conducting what basically amounted to 100 Sokal hoaxes, he knew better than to claim anything causal from that data.
Yeah, he was presenting a piece of evidence. He conducted, this is a good kind of experiment that was going on in the social sciences that she's explaining. And it, it's a piece of evidence towards the fact that there could be a causal relationship. It doesn't prove it, but it's a piece of evidence.
Contrast this with Sokal, who published one paper and concluded not only that the journal is biased, but what is causing that bias. And
you know what? I would agree with the fact that Sokal is using the word prove in a way that is incorrect here. I would agree, because he says, my hoax proves only that editors... Now, he should have said, my hoax is just a piece of evidence towards the fact that there could be an ideological bias. But I feel like we're being a bit uncharitable. We're kind of splitting hairs here, because I think when you say it in common parlance, and you're talking, you say, my work demonstrates something, or my work proves something, 99% of the time you're saying my work makes a strong inference towards something. It's not a deductive logical proof 100% guaranteed, but it's something that in natural language you tend to say. Okay.
Let's actually contrast them. Epstein tested papers that both aligned with and went against the bias he was interested in. Sokal only tested an aligned paper. Epstein had a decently large sample size. Sokal had a sample size of 1. Epstein used actual, verified analytical methods. Sokal pointed to a single data point and said, look, it's ideological bias. On the one hand, we have a researcher doing a real experiment.
It would have been good. It would have been good. It would have been better. I'm not disagreeing here. The more rigorous you can be in... The only thing I would disagree about here is that Sokal, I don't think Sokal believes that he deductively or 100% proved that the editors were ideologically biased. I think what he's trying to say is that there was evidence towards the fact that the editors had some bias.
On the other, we have a physicist doing that physicist thing of thinking he can contribute to a field he underestimates while simultaneously showing that he doesn't understand it. And I say he on purpose. This comparison of Sokal to Epstein comes from a paper titled The Sokal Affair in Context, where STS professor Stephen Hillgartner compares not only how the 2 experiments were conducted, but how they were received. I'll talk more about Sokal's reception in a little bit, but as a preview, he got way more attention than Epstein in both academia and mass media. People accepted Sokal's conclusion more readily than Epstein's, and Sokal's deceit was generally portrayed as clever, while Epstein's deceit became a huge ethics scandal that almost lost him his job, which is weird, because Epstein did a legitimate and rigorous experiment, and Sokal did not. So why? Why did the garbage experiment get all the hype and the real research get shunted into obscurity? Hilgartner proposes a few possible reasons, one being their different pre-hoax perceptions. At the time of the affair, Sokal was a physicist at a prestigious university. He had a high-status job in a high-status field. Epstein, on the other hand, was working as a social worker and wasn't employed by a university at the time he was conducting his study. It wouldn't be so unreasonable to conclude that Sokal's university affiliation and expertise in a high-status field could have made him seem more credible than some rando with a normie job in the real world. And though that's Hilgartner's explanation for why the Sokal hoax in its entirety was so successful, it could easily be used to explain why the social text accepted his paper. Maybe instead of ideological bias towards postmodern nonsense, social text accepted Sokal's paper without understanding it because they believed...
Okay, so maybe they had some other bias. They had some other bias they shouldn't have had. That was an authority bias. Okay, maybe they had an authority bias. This is possible. It's a possible inference, yeah.
The university professor from a field known for its high standard of rigor would be a reliable source for commentary on physics. That would still be a bias, but a different one than the one Sokal claims. One that also has some evidence backing it. Sokal's paper was actually used in another experiment that demonstrated people are more likely to believe nonsense, the Sokal paper, if they're told it's written by a famous academic than if they're told it's written by a student.
Yeah.
And of course, I can't prove that the social text is biased because the editors were blinded by the prestige of academic physics with the available information, but that's kind of my point. The events of the Sokal affair do not constitute a rich enough data set to decisively identify the reason for the erroneous publication. His justification for why he thinks certain scholars lack rigor itself lacks rigor.
Okay, so this is all based on the fact that Sokal said prove instead of I'm making an inference. My hoax provides evidence that the editors... Okay, so this is based on this. I don't think Sokal or anybody really thinks that you can 100% prove an ideological bias. I don't think you can even do that. You can't. You're going to be providing some evidence, and then when the evidence becomes enough, you say, look, it's likely they had an ideological bias. I don't know.
That's the poetic irony of the Sokal affair that so many people miss. He used a sloppy, unrigorous facsimile of an STS experiment to argue that STS as a discipline is not real.
No, you can't say that. Oh my God, no, this is wrong now. This is very important. In the quote she brought up in her own video, Sokal doesn't argue that STS as a discipline is not rigorous. He's explicitly saying only. He's explicitly... The quote that she uses in her own video is arguing against her on this point. Please don't say this. Please don't say that he argued that STS as a discipline is not rigorous, because he... Look. Let me go and get the full quote. Okay, so we have the full quote of what was quoted by Dr. Fatima. Okay, so the full quote is... From the mere fact of publication of my parody, I think that not much can be deduced. Let me repeat. From the mere fact of publication of my parody, I think that not much can be deduced. This is the guy who's, deducing that the entire field of science and technology studies is all bullshit. This is the guy who's trying to own everybody. It doesn't prove that the whole field of cultural studies or cultural studies of science, much less sociology of science, is nonsense. Nor does it prove that the intellectual standard in these fields are generally lax. This might be the case, but it would have to be established on other grounds. It proves only that the editors of one rather marginal journal were derelict in their intellectual duty, and then the quote that Dr. Fatima puts in her video goes on. So, I ask you, is it fair to use this quote in the way that it's being used, portrayed in the video right now? I think it says exactly the opposite of what she's trying to say. He doesn't do anything. He explicitly says, even in the quote that has been put in the video, even the quote she used, even the clipped thing she uses. Okay.
Rigorous. And to be clear, he was trying to do an STS experiment. Hilgarten spends a good chunk of his Sokal-Epstein comparison establishing that their hoax-like experiments, as he calls them, fall squarely within the purview of the exact field Sokal aims to undermine. The issues that interest Sokal are among the central questions of STS. How do research communities evaluate the credibility of knowledge claims? How well do scholarly journals, peer-reviewed standard methodologies, and other technologies of trust function? How do academic subcultures become institutionalized and self-perpetuating?
Yes, but Sokal is not trying to, eliminate the field of STS from existence. By his own admission, he's not trying to say that everything that goes on is completely fraudulent. Like, in the quote you presented in your own video.
Rather than representing a wholly novel line of research, Sokal's experiment is merely the latest contribution to a controversial literature. So despite being a physicist with no training in STS research methods, the Sokal hoax was, in the most literal sense possible, an STS experiment. But like, an embarrassingly poor STS experiment. And
okay, I don't think Sokal even... He might have referred to the Sokal hoax as an experiment sometimes, but I don't think... Nobody thinks that the Sokal hoax is an experiment in the scientific terminology of the word. It's just, a prank. It's a prank. That's what people refer to it. It's a prank that was meant to get a certain dialogue happening.
Sokal's subsequent assertion that his experiment says anything conclusive about an ideological bias in cultural studies...
No! Oh God, don't say this. Don't say that Sokal says that his experiment says something about an ideological bias in cultural studies, when the quote you put on your own video says the opposite.
Or even just social text is not only wrong...
Yeah, or even just social text. Yeah, that last part is the part that is more correct when it comes to your quote.
Shows that he underestimates the intellectual rigor required to make claims about things like ideological bias in academic publishing. And you know who can inform him on how to rigorously study things like ideological biases in academic publishing? Scholars in the exact discipline he's clumsily claiming lacks intellectual rigor. I could not make this more dramatically ironic if I tried. It's actually ironic on multiple levels. 3 according to Hilgarten. There's Sokal discipline he's clumsily claiming lacks intellectual...
He's not claiming that the entire discipline lacks intellectual rigor. In the quote you put in your own video, he's not saying that. Even in the clipped part of the quote, you say, he's explicitly saying that what he only proves is that the people in the journal. And you know what, I'll be even super charitable. He shouldn't have said it proves only. He should have said it provides evidence for the fact that the editors of one rather marginal journal. But, I mean... Okay, I agree. He used the bad language when he said it proves only. He should have said it provides evidence for the fact that they were derelict in their duty. I mean, it does prove that they were derelict in their duty in that case. But it doesn't immediately prove that it was due to some kind of bias. Maybe it was due to an authority bias instead of a postmodern bias, whatever that is. So yeah, it doesn't prove which kind of bias they had. I agree. Sokal shouldn't have used the word proves there, but I think reasonable people understand that he wasn't saying he has constructed a deductive proof that 100% guarantees that the guys had this kind or that kind of ideological bias. He was saying that it provides evidence towards the fact that the editors in that journal were probably not on the best behavior or something like that.
Rigor. I could not make this more dramatically ironic if I tried.
No, sorry, I have to put my headphones on.
It's actually ironic on multiple levels. 3 according to Hilgarten. There's Sokal doing an experiment in, and therefore implicitly endorsing the value of, the field he's trying to discredit. There's this absurd...
No, he's not trying to discredit the field. Okay, I think you get it anyway.
Self-representation of Sokal as a champion of academic standards while he is himself not meeting any kind of reasonable academic standard. And then there's this third level that I think Reddit user woke up a bug articulated better than Hilgartner. Yeah, I'm gonna cite a Reddit post. What are you gonna...
Is Sokal posturing himself as some kind of academic champion? I don't think that's the case. I mean, could you provide some evidence? Anyway.
Do about it. It's difficult to resist the conclusion that the Sokal hoax has, in effect, reverse Sokal hoaxed its admirers. The only evident reason why the social text affair should breed indignation while the other cases of worse problems go ignored is that this suits the particular taste and agenda of the people reacting in this way. And the whole point of the Sokal hoax was to reveal this kind of cognitive error, so this is a particularly ironic result.
Yeah, so what is being said here is right in a sense, but you shouldn't have indignation only for one part of the academic world that has problems in peer review. It's all parts of academia that have problems in peer review should face criticism. I agree. If you have selective indignation for some journals that do some employ some bad practices, and that's wrong. But I don't know.
Sokal made all this fuss about the academic left being ideologically biased in what they choose to publish.
No, it's not the academic left, okay? Oh, you know what? I just said this. I said this already. In the quote she put in the video, in her own quote, he explicitly says that his hoax only shows something regarding social text, not the broader academic left in general. Of course, it does provide some evidence, towards the fact that there might be some issue in some paper in a certain sphere of academic thought. Of course, provides evidence also towards the fact that the broader academic sphere might be having some issues. But it doesn't conclusively prove stuff like that, as Sokal says.
The Sokal affair only made any kind of impact because of how well it served people who want to argue against the legitimacy of scholarship on things like Marxism and feminism, a politically motivated confirmation bias that demonstrates the same thing he's accusing social...
What? Wait a minute. So now it demonstrates. So now it does demonstrate something. It doesn't demonstrate that there was a bias in social text. It demonstrates there was a bias against feminism and Marxism. Sorry.
Because of how well it served people who want to argue against the legitimacy of scholarship on things like Marxism and feminism, a politically motivated confirmation bias that demonstrates the same thing
He demonstrated the opposite of what he was accusing social text of. So now he demonstrated it. So now, according to your own standards of language, the standards you are applying to Alan Sokal, the standards of the fact that he used prove instead of provides evidence before, now you're going to use the word demonstrate here. You're going to drop it and say, he demonstrated that there's an ideological bias against Marxism and feminism. I'm sorry if I get agitated. I'm sorry now. I realize I'm getting a bit agitated. I started it. I'm sorry if I get agitated. It's that I shouldn't get so worked up. I'm sorry. It's just, it's painful to me to hear certain things when I think Sokal is trying to help. And when I think Dr. Fatima herself is trying to help, to be honest. So, I don't know, it pains me that there's this miscommunication going on. In the last part of the video, Dr. Fatima argues that the political implications of the Sokal hoax have been negative for the left. Now, this is a matter of opinion, but I really disagree. I think the Sokal hoax really strengthened the left, and I think the right would really benefit from people who had as incisive criticisms as the one Sokal had for the left. But this is just opinion. More confusingly, perhaps, at a certain point, Dr. Fatima praises Noam Chomsky for his good faith criticism of postmodernism.
I generally try to conclude my videos with some thought-provoking discussion question based on its thesis, but I was having a hard time coming up with a way to do that here because besides just debunking the popular perception of the Sokal affair, I don't know if I have a point to make. That is, I didn't until I was reading the comments people left on a Q&A I recorded for my Patreon link in the description, and saw that someone had, in full sincerity, recommended I check out this really interesting paper they found called Transgressing the Boundaries. They quoted a few lines that articulate what I believe are legitimately useful ideas and questions relevant to the topic we were discussing, and even though they had read the paper critically enough to successfully clock some of it as a bit woo-woo, my heart broke a little, seeing someone so earnestly and enthusiastically engage with an essay that was written to mock such a person. It just...
No, it wasn't written to mock such a person. It was written to help exactly these kinds of people. Like, my heart goes out to these people too. I think that's exactly where Sokal's heart is too. That he doesn't want people to get fooled by nonsense. So that's exactly the kind of person we're trying to help. Sokal is trying to help. I was once a young boy going to university, and I had this great admiration for academia as a whole and for professors, and I really loved academia. I see everything with rosy glasses, and this little dum-dum would just go to the classes, waddle along, and eventually I waddled into some garbage classes. In garbage classes that not only of a postmodern sphere, but even other garbage classes. And in these classes, I would go home and I would try to really intensely study, because I couldn't believe that some people in academia could say stuff that was, nonsense or nonsensical or counterproductive or useless or whatever it may be. And after, I don't know, what took me about 5 or 6 months, because I'm a big dum-dum, it suddenly started to dawn on me, because I started to read other stuff in the literature I'm talking about. Just to be clear now, I'm talking about actually math, some courses of math that some people were given. And I realized the stuff he was saying was wrong. It was wrong. And I was being fooled. And it was a very painful experience for me when I discovered that I had been fooled. And I would have much rather had been fooled by a prank that would taught me to be a bit more skeptical, or to have a bit more critical thinking of what's going on in what I'm being taught. But it is even a growing experience in which you kind of start to pick and choose and start to say, okay, so maybe some professors are not that good. Maybe some others are better. And I think everybody that works in academia, and even the students, know this. Some courses are better than others. Some professors are better than others. And now I see the subtitle here, and it's it's riling me up again. A bad faith publicity stunt. It sucks to see a bad faith publicity stunt. It's a bad faith. I get it that you think it's bad faith, but I don't think it's bad faith.
Sucks to see a bad faith publicity stunt mislead someone who is genuinely interested in learning. Kind of like how Social Text seemed like a really cool publication that is doing the important work of platforming unconventional and challenging ideas. But that's exactly what made it so easy for Sokal to exploit. I asked at the top of this video what people's preconceptions about the Sokal affair were, and for anyone who gave an answer, I'm curious as to how you feel about it now. The interesting thing is, whether you came across his paper and read it in earnest like my Patreon subscriber did, or you were someone who knew and accepted his story about it, you were misled by Alan Sokal's intellectual dishonesty. How does that make you feel?
No. Please don't say. Please don't say intellectual dishonesty, please. Please don't say intellectual dishonesty, like... Please don't say intellectual dishonesty, please.
How does it feel to think you're following a real academic discourse, only to find out the person you gave your respect and attention to was kind of a hack? Seriously, I want you to tell me how you feel.
Kind of a hack. Sokal was kind of a hack. Are you, Dr. Fatima, trying to own Sokal right now? Are you being kind and charitable to Sokal, I wonder? When, he wrote 2 books explaining his motivations for the hoax. Oh no, it feels to me you're being a bit mean. It feels to me that maybe you want to dunk on Sokal a bit.
By means of counterexample, of course, what actually productive arguments about things like ideology look like. Sokal's argument certainly created a big spectacle, but I don't think there's any reading of the events where it was part of a constructive discourse with postmodernists. And that's not because it's impossible to have a productive conversation between perspectives that are that different. Such a conversation is wonderfully exemplified in a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault from the 70s, where they argued over whether such a thing as innate human nature exists. Highly recommend checking it out. They weren't talking about science per se, but their stances map onto the 2 perspectives of the science wars pretty well. Chomsky said there is some objective universal shared experience of being human, and Foucault countered that any such experience can be explained as socially constructed in a particular context. And it's incredible. You can feel the mutual respect they have for each other, their sincere...
Well, I'm sorry, I have to explain why this part... I shouldn't laugh, sorry. But you have to know that Chomsky didn't have respect for the postmodern part of academia. Like, Noam Chomsky is not the guy you want to quote to say there's going to be mutual respect from different segments of academia. He's just not the guy. It's pretty clear to me that Dr. Fatima has only seen this piece of information concerning Chomsky and postmodernism.
Your interest in understanding the other's perspective, the dedication to a common goal of advancing humanity, and just as notable as what's there is what's not. No gotcha tactics, no intellectual posturing, no desire to humiliate or discredit or even defeat the other. Just a conversation that leaves everyone with a broader understanding than they had.
Okay, so let me just quote some stuff Chomsky says about postmodernism.
Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. I mean, there isn't a drive among intellectuals to make things look difficult. It's a kind of self-protection. I mean, if what I'm doing can be done by, the guy who's repairing my furnace, okay, then who am I, and then there's those physicists over there who talk complicated things and have to, and I don't understand them, so I'd like to be like them, That drive is clearly there.
Here is Chomsky showing his mutual respect for what he calls postmodern cults. Those are his words, postmodern cults. What I find is extremely pretentious, but on examination, a lot of it is simply illiterate, based on extraordinary misreadings of text that I know well, sometimes that I have written. Argument that is appalling in its casual lack of elementary self-criticism. Lots of statements that are trivial, though dressed up in complicated verbiage, or false, and a good deal of plain gibberish. This is Chomsky talking about postmodern cults. Just to add another thing, Chomsky was an admirer of Alan Sokal. Why do I say was? Chomsky isn't dead. Chomsky is an admirer of Alan Sokal. He publicly recommends his book, Fashionable Nonsense.
There's a very important book by Jean Bertrand and Alan Sokal, I forget what it's called, Dangerous Illusions or something, where they simply go through they happen to concentrate on Paris, which is the center of the rot, but it's all over. And they go through the most respected French intellectuals and run through what they say about science. And, it is so embarrassing that you kind of cringe when you read it.
I think this kind of misleads the viewer on Chomsky's broader views about the matter, and I'll leave it at that.
The start. And that's a beautiful thing. I think it's pretty obvious which side of the science wars division I land on, but I really appreciated Chomsky's critique of postmodernism. I don't agree with
Chomsky's critique of postmodernism. So Chomsky is extremely harsh towards postmodernism. Really, really harsh. And his critique is sometimes so brutal that sometimes I agree with the critics of his critique that say he's not really, exemplifying enough. He just really dismisses a lot of the part of postmodern academia, to use this vague term, this vague category. He just dismisses it out of hand, basically. He's extremely harsh on postmodernism. I would venture to say more harsher than Alan Sokal. If you hear the things Chomsky says, I would say they're more harsher than Sokal.
If you look at the phenomenon as a whole, its effect has been, I think the effect is pretty clear. It allows people to take a very radical stance, more radical than thou, but to be completely dissociated from anything that's happening for many reasons. One reason is nobody can understand a word they're saying, so they're already dissociated. It's kind of like a private lingo, and it's very, there's a lot of material reward that comes from it. Like if you're part of that system, you can run around to conferences and get big professorships and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of sort of conventional material reward.
all his points, but his arguments have value to me because they actually engage with real ideas from someone who believes and understands them. I myself have made plenty of critiques of progressive ideas like DEI initiatives and other things I believe are superficial attempts at social justice in STEM. But there's a world of difference between good faith critique that is rooted in understanding something you want to make better and performatively taking down a caricature of a political opinion for sport. I genuinely don't think Sokal even understands the perspectives of the thinkers he's so invested in mocking. I don't think he's cared to try. Like, his approach to talking about social things...
He hasn't cared to try in the 2 books he's written where he quotes authors in depth. Okay, I'm just repeating myself at this point.
Scientific communities is kind of a trope at this point, and after the amount of time I've spent advocating for whatever kind of inclusive policies in physics and astronomy departments, I can spot it from a mile away. It's the guy who refuses to say that he doesn't understand why something is problematic, so he plays devil's advocate in order to engage with it in ignorance while still being able to posture as intellectually superior. And the thing about this guy is that he doesn't realize that his arguments betray a potentially unconscious but nonetheless impactful investment in hegemonic power structures, because implicit bias makes it very easy for people to undermine their own moral beliefs and unwittingly recreate the systems of oppression they've been socialized in since birth, especially if part of their self-perception is how objective and able to be unbiased they are because they can solve complicated math problems. Sokal is textbook that guy. But I'm not here to just dunk on that guy. I want to learn from him.
Are you sure you're not here to dunk on the guy you call kind of a hack and intellectually dishonest, doing abnormal things? I don't know.
Like to propose a little experiment in good faith critique. As today's comment section discussion question that anyone can participate in, whether they already knew about the Sokal affair or not, do you have any constructive criticism for me? Not just in this video, I mean any of my work. Maybe this is your first time on my channel, in which case, welcome. I recommend you check out some of my other videos. I think they're very good, but I know they're not perfect because I'm a human and we're all fallible. So I want to know from the people who watch and at least somewhat enjoy my work, how I can make it better. When did I say something that was completely off the mark? Where was my approach to communicating an idea undermining my point? What is some blind spot that you can see in my thinking that I can't yet? If you have an answer to any of these questions, I invite you to leave it in a comment because I am going to make a video where I try to honestly respond to your good faith criticism. Based on the history of my comment section, I imagine I might get some less than well-intentioned submissions. So here's what I expect from a comment to consider engaging with it. Don't start from ignorance. Spend at least 5 minutes on Google trying to prove yourself wrong before you come at me so you don't waste my time. Motivate your critique. If the correction doesn't matter in some way, I don't really care.
Okay, this is all good.
Nice. I know I'm just a face on a screen to you, but in reality, I'm a person with feelings, and being attuned to that fact is part of communicating effectively. In return, here...
Have you been nice to Alan Sokal in your video? They called him kind of a hack, and then... No, but jokes aside, this part is good. Is a good part of the video. I agree with it. She's asking for criticism. And I'm sure she's going to get harsh criticism, etc., etc. It's a good thing to do.
Here's what you can expect from me. I will read every single comment until some arbitrary cutoff point where I feel like I have enough to make a video, up to 400 words, let's say. No theses, please. I will save every criticism that I initially don't think is good and come back to it for a second look after some time away, and I will engage respectfully with whatever responses I ultimately decide to put in the video, which will obviously be a small and biased subset of the total responses, but again, I am human. But yeah, come at me with your well-intentioned critiques, and I'll do my best to practice what I'm preaching and humble myself enough to grow from them. I have no idea how this is going to go down, but I am genuinely excited to find out. As much as I understand that the Sokal affair, wasn't the own people think it was, I do understand the appeal. Look, I get it. Doing the whole facts and reason, argument annihilation, hitch slap debate bro routine is legitimately fun. Really, I used to do it a lot. It made me feel very smart and special, especially when everybody claps after. Debate team was truly a hell of a drug. But no,
but that's not what debate is supposed to be. Debate is not supposed to be a hitch slap, owning, dunking on somebody. What good debate is supposed to be is two people coming together to argue about something, trying to understand the argument map of the person you're arguing with, to then get closer to truth, to then evaluate the premises, evaluate if the argument is sound and valid, and if you evaluate all these things step by step, and then you say, oh, I guess your argument is valid, and maybe you change your mind, or maybe you change the other person's mind. And my mind has been changed a lot of times by debates, by philosophers who have written something, an argument, and I've analyzed the argument, and I think it's correct. It's a way to get closer to truth. It's not a way to dunk on people, to own people. Of course, some people use sophistry in debates, and they try to dunk on people, they try to humiliate people. Yeah, that does happen, but good debate is not meant to be that way.
No matter how it's intended, that's not the kind of critique that actually makes communities, be they political or scientific, stronger. It's an ego boost. And as with so many things that boost our egos, we must ask of it. Does it serve us?
No, it's not. Debate is not meant to be an ego boost. It's not meant to be an ego boost. It's meant to be a way for two people to find the truth when it's done well, to come together and find truth. If you're doing it as an ego booster, it's done completely wrong, and I'm sorry she had this experience in her debate classes. I'm really sorry that she had this experience.
Bad. Owning others is a hollow victory that leaves us spiritually empty and disconnected from the experience of collaborative intellectual exploration that is argument.
I agree.
And what a beautiful collaboration it can be. Disagreeing with each other can be the starting point of so much learning.
I
But when
agree.
the well of discourse is poisoned by ill-intended actors, everybody loses. So let's learn from the Sokal affair.
Yeah, but
Let's
Sokal-
make our critiques, have our debates, help each other to
Sokal wasn't an ill-intended actor.
refine our thinking about the world, yes, but let's do it with curiosity, humility, and respect for our differences. In other words, let's keep our egos in check, and at least try not to be assholes to each other. Lord knows I'm working on it.
I agree, and I'll take her word that she's gonna be working on it. To conclude, I would just say that Alan Sokal, a self-described socialist who has written 2 books explaining why he did the hoax that are not referenced or cited once in the video, I think he might deserve a bit more of good faith. I think the bar for good faith is being placed a bit too high here in this instance. I do, however, agree with Dr. Fatima that the Sokal hoax is often used as a way of dunking on people or trying to own people online. And that is not appropriate. That's bad. So, yeah, you shouldn't do that. However, I sincerely hope she reconsiders some of the key points Sokal makes, as I believe there are valuable insights to be found in some of his arguments. Here's to better online discourse.